Hey guys, welcome back. This time around I think we're gonna go over the project settings and the editor settings. They deserve their own video because they're quite extensive. You access these by going to the edit menu and selecting one of each. We're gonna start with the project settings because this is our project, and once we open this up you're gonna see that there's quite a bunch of stuff here. And actually, while we're at it, we might as well, get the other one as well, which would be the editor preferences. So now we've got two tabs here. All right, first things first, on the project settings here, you can actually access all of the settings, but as you can see, there is quite a lot of them. They're also stored in your version control system, so technically these are on a per project basis and they're shared across your members. So whatever you set this here, you check out the file, and then whatever changes you make to the project settings will be reflected on your other members. We're actually going to go through the categories because I find them to be a little bit more, it's more structured, right? We're not going to be changing anything just yet. Usually you go over this after you're done making your game. In other words, your game is complete. You have to set everything up, but I think it's nice to have an understanding on what everything here does. So first of all, when it comes to description, it's quite simple. The project thumbnail obviously is the thumbnail you see in the over here, right, in your Unreal launcher. That's quite simple to figure out. You can obviously replace it with your own logo if you want. Description, also fairly self-explanatory. Now when it comes to the project ID, I'm not sure what it's for, but I think it has to do something with releasing the game. I'm not sure. So I think you should just, it's like a copyright thing or whatever, like so that your project is like so that if you hold this key, basically that means that you made the game, I think, or something like that. I'm not sure what it's for, but whatever. The project name, obviously, here is you type in here what your current project name is, and so is the version. You can fill in here the publisher, the company, the legal stuff. This is fairly right. Like I don't have to explain it to you. Unreal, by the way, has these copyright and licensing terms on their page. So once you release the game, if you're about to be making money, you need to fill this stuff out. Okay, the project title, like the displayed stuff, this is basically what you see at the top of the browser. In other words, if we open up my computer, as you can see here, it says this PC. And essentially this is what will be said if you write something here, right here, right? You don't, in general, you don't really need this. Okay, next we've got the settings, which is it's basically for your game, like when it started up. Should it start in VR, or do you want it to run full screen, or maybe a borderless window? These are the three buttons here, so if you allow those, these will be available. If you don't allow them, obviously you probably won't be able to close the player, so they'll have to actually kill the process, the actual user. It's not a very good idea to remove these options from them. Okay, so this is that tab, the description tab done. Now we've got the gameplay tags here. Now the gameplay tags are mostly used. Now there's two types of tagging systems in Unreal. One of the first ones are object tags, where you just define a tag in the object and you can retrieve the tag. You can check the tag after you retrieve the object, whereas, at least this is my understanding of how the system works. And this one actually is like an overarching sorting system. In other words, let's say we have an object called gun, and we got a bunch of guns, so we want to find the pistol. Okay, so like the pistol is a gun, and let's say I want to find a particular model, or let's say I want to find the pistol that deals that has armor penetration bullets. So we have a pistol with armor penetration bullets, which is a gun, right? So you find every gun in the scene or in the game, and then do you really want to Like, do you really want to grab all of these guns and work with them, or do you just need the one with the armor penetration bullets? So essentially, once you have it tagged in the object editor as armor penetration, like APEN or something, you can just look for that tag, and the program, the engine will return that object. It will give you the object with the APEN tag on it. When you have these gameplay tags here, it's basically the same thing, but you don't have to retrieve the object, so you don't have to get all the guns to find the one with the armor penetration. So you basically add an APEN here, and obviously here to the array table list, and then say it's a gun with a tag armor penetration, and you can look up this thing. You can find this object through the code. We're not gonna need this because, like I said, we're only gonna have 3 objects on our scene at any given moment. So this is not useful for us, at least for this game. The gameplay tags developer thing is I don't really know what that is for. It only has one tab. We probably don't need this, since we don't need the gameplay tags. As far as I know, this is only for importing stuff. Like if you want to import it to someone else, give your gameplay tags to another team member, which I find strange, because I believe, yeah, these are checked out, so they are source controlled, so it doesn't really matter here. Anyway, when it comes to maps and modes, this is your default stuff. Like, obviously most of these can be changed in the editor. You don't have to change them through the project settings. These are your default values. For example, right now our starting level, when we load up the editor, is minimal default. I prefer to keep it this way, at least for bigger games or things that have more assets to it, because it just opens up the project a lot faster. You can load up your map after that, but it'll at least you'll be in the engine. I'd leave it at minimal default. You don't want it to go to advanced lighting or starter map because they're a lot more complicated. There's more stuff to load. Obviously, you can just create a new level, an empty level, and have that, but I just like the minimal default one. And obviously, the game default map is the one where the game itself is going to play. So, you can have 2 separate maps. When you drop it down here, you've got your little, if you have any options, these are like command console commands where you go with a dash. So you don't really need that. The transition map is generally, it's like if you have a loading screen, so this would be your loading screen if you had a transition map. So if you got a couple of levels, and this would be your transition map. If you could, like if you've ever played Assassin's Creed, and when you're doing loading, you just play around in that void or whatever it's called. And obviously the server default map is if you have a server, which we don't have. You got the settings for your local multiplayer, split screen, three player split screen, fairly standard stuff. And your game instance should be your game instance. Just don't bother with that unless you plan to do some engine modifications. The game mode, the most important one. Basically, this is your default game mode, as in when you create a new level, this is the game mode that's going to be assigned to it. But you can have many different ones. And obviously, once you change one, you can add more game modes. By the way, you can create a new blueprint and assign different game modes. But in general, just don't bother with them and keep them there. Which actually you can assign it to your server. And we can have some prefixes. Maybe have a map which is like if you use, let's say Counter-Strike, you got maps which use CS, which would be search and rescue operations, and then you got DE, which would be a demolition operation. If you play CS:GO anyway, but it depends. Like you can have these for different maps if you have a multiplayer game. Right. Next on the line is the movies tab. Now, this is fairly simple. I mean, there's not much to explain here. Are movies skippable, and should you wait for the movies to complete? So, if the movies are skippable, kind of counterintuitive. Like if you have both of these, and here's where you add all your startup movies, which could be, I believe, in MP4 format. I'm not sure what kind of format they take. Next one, we've got the packaging. This is essentially when you're building the game already. In other words, you should be defining here how big your files, how big your textures are, and if you got different languages, what kind of languages you've got, etc., etc. In general, you've got your different build configurations, which is like debugging is, well, like it's when you got the C++ thing going, but development is what you usually want to do. Shipping is when you're already ready for deployment, when your game is ready. Obviously, you have a staging directory, which should be this is where you're gonna build your game. In other words, so have it available like somewhere where you've got your like within the project, obviously. The full rebuild one is essentially forcing the game to the engine to rebuild everything that's been changed, as far as I remember. Yeah, only modified files will be built. Yeah, so the development basically is like an updating build. For distribution is when you're already, so you got your shipping, and then you select for distribution, which would be like it will be like for distribution. I mean, how difficult that is to understand, but the debug files, you don't really need them in general. As for packaging, this all depends on what kind of game you have. You can have chunks, or you can have pack files, or you can have both. This basically is how it depends on how big your levels are and how big your assets are. And if you got chunks, it's essentially like it's for level streaming and for loading levels without loading screens, if I remember correctly. But we don't really need any of that. Same goes for localizations. Now, when you've got different languages, I believe you're going to have to actually write them down, or at least have them selectable here. But if you got two different voiceovers in Arabic and in Akan, or whatever this is, like you basically include both of them, but that's going to bloat your file size as an installation size. And this essentially is all about the languages, right? You've got your encryption or whatever. If you like, this is nice for people that just try to open up your files and open up the INI, the configuration files inside their folders, and edit a couple of numbers, and all of a sudden they're at the top of the leaderboard. So that's gonna prevent that, at least to a degree. Obviously, they can still do it through a hex editor. This is nice because you exclude the editor content when you're cooking, but obviously this has its own risks. So it's up to you when you do this. You shouldn't be using anything. And after that, you've got the support of the blueprints. By the way, like, you don't need any of this stuff right now. So this we'll go through this again once we're done with our game. Over here we got the supported platforms, which you should just enable all platforms. And the target hardware, you could actually configure your target hardware. I believe I think it was possible to like have a particular setup, but this is essentially mobile or tablet, and what kind of quality you're running. Now this is the more interesting stuff, the engine bits. Here you've got the AI tab, where you essentially set up all the classes and the movement allowed to the AI. For example, the acceptance radius means if you have a player that has to move like a top-down clicker type deal like Diablo, the acceptance radius is basically means that the AI, which you will be ordering around, right? Or if you have an RTS, you have to order around stuff. It's essentially 5 centimeters. And as in, like, within 5 centimeters of your click, this is where the the actor or the object or whatever you're moving will arrive, and will consider this command executed. And you've got the same thing for for these other different settings, like path following nav link. If you got a shift right click, right. And you can obviously set these up where it's called finish move on goal overlap. In other words, if you've got something on your goal, you're going to stop moving. You're not going to go through the, like, let's say you click on a statue, and your character is not going to go through the statue. It's going to stop in front of the statue. Now, accept strafing, I'm not entirely sure what that is, but I think it's going to allow your character to go sideways, which could have some funny effects. It's not just going to go straight to follow a line or trajectory just to your where you clicked him. I'm not entirely sure what that is. It just says it's just a transition time flag gameplay task. I have no idea what this is for, really. Also, I have no idea what this is, and I have no idea what this is. I mean, I know what this is in general. This is for raycasting, I think. This is how your AI is basically um, seeing things. So if you had, let's say, but like I think you can change this on a per character basis. So if you want to see through walls, like you'd be checking for only destructibles for pawns, like you've got different setups. Visibility, I believe, is everything that's visible. I'm not sure what this is really for, but it seems like basically a separate rendering channel or something. Anyway, after that we've got the animation settings here, which again are only basically compression settings, so that your animations take up less space. Now I'm not sure what these two mean. You probably need to do some research, or probably I will, before we release the game. Then again, our game is going to be small. We're not going to have more than 2 or 3 animations, and really this stuff is it's too high-end for our needs. Just know that in this tab over here you have all your animation settings. In other words, how many, what kind of compression is this going to have, right? Obviously you can play around with these settings if you want, and have different builds depending on what you expect to be the result, and just to see what happens. But in general, you don't really need to touch these settings here, at least when it comes to animation. Well, in our scenario it doesn't. When it comes to audio, it's basically the same stuff. You've got your quality levels, which are 2 or 3. You've got your file name format, which is only needed for dialogue when you're when you're generating conversations. You don't need to touch these to disable these reverbs and master EQ, because it's gonna basically rip control out of you and when you're using the cues and the sound in the game. Now, obviously I'm not a sound engineer or a sound designer or a sound guy in general, so I'm not very well versed in how to use these tools. But in general, we don't really need that much high quality control over what we're going to do. We just need something basic to be running. So just don't bother with these settings as well. Collision is fairly interesting because this is where you create your objects and trace channels. So if you've got, basically it depends on what you want the engine to run through. Let's say you want to ray trace, and ray trace is basically like firing a laser from your gun. Let's say you want a gun that shoots through walls, so you need to define a ray trace that could actually shoot through walls. Same goes for objects. Let's say you want to throw something through a force field from which the player cannot move. So if you throw something through a force field, once it hits the force field, it has to recognize that it's not. It can go through it, in other words. So you define this stuff here, but obviously you have the presets, and honestly, most of these presets, like 90% of the time, they'll be perfectly suffice your needs, unless you plan to do something fancy. After that, you've got the console, which is the setting here for your console. Like when you press the, my bad. When you open up the console here, I think you can actually open up the full command line, but you don't really need that. I think the output log is the one here where you can look at, yeah. So these are the colors for that. So these are edited preferences. Then we got the cooker. This is a fairly important bit here. It's essentially your compression for the textures, how compressed or how big they're going to be. The bigger they are, the more the more defined they are, the better quality it is. Obviously, it's the size versus speed of cooking is also important. But in general, you don't really care about your cooking speed, so you should probably go for 4, which is best quality. At least versus when it comes to speed. But then again, this also means that loading is also going to be a problem for the target machine. So you may be fine with cooking let's say you may be fine with cooking a texture for a long time, although in this case it probably wouldn't matter. But this essentially is about balancing a game. If you got performance issues, maybe like essentially for a mobile, you probably have all zeros here, or at least 1 or 2 maybe. For PCs, they've got loads of space and pretty powerful GPUs. You probably just max everything out. The compression quality is you probably leave it at 2. Obviously, it depends on what kind of definition you have on your characters and what kind of resolution you've got on your textures. Here you've got your cooking view network in the background editor, which is basically, I think it's like a swarm. I have no idea what DDC data is. It's basically just speeds up launch on. and iterative cook info builds launch from the editor. This is also apparently something fancy. You could enable these and see what they do. I'd never really bother here with these. This is nice. You can compile the blueprints. This will compile them in development mode when cooking. Classes excluded and excluded from when building. This is nice because you don't want everything on your server and on your client. Like you might want some stuff on your server and some stuff specifically on your client. So let's say if you have bullets flying around, you want the bullets to be calculated on the server and on the client. So if you got a bullet calculation class or something that works as a controller for your bullet calculations, you probably need this on the dedicated server. When it comes to bullet decals, however, as in, let's say when you shoot a wall, you shoot a stone, you shoot something, right? You essentially create a bullet hole, right? But you need it to be only visible on the client. The server doesn't really care if there's a bullet hole there or not, because it doesn't have a gameplay impact. All right, it's only a texture. So you'd exclude this from the server, and you'd exclude some server files from the client. After that, you've got your crowd manager, which is quite simple, really. It's basically for your crowd, right? For a bunch of NPCs. Mostly it has to be about optimization here. So you've got your optimization interval, and you've got your check interval. Obviously, the higher it is, the more task intensive this is going to be. If you got some sampling patterns, like how the crowd is going to move around, how many times it's going to check for nav meshes, etc. Not for nav meshes, but like for obstacles, such as, I don't know, trash cans, holes, etc. Avoidance config is a very cool thing as well. You've got your different settings here for how your crowd is going to move. Obviously, you want to do this from this tab here in general, because most of the time you're going to have a bunch of NPCs at the same place. You don't necessarily want to be editing each of their AI. Even though if they're sharing the AI, you might want to have different crowds. Then you've got your user settings, which essentially, well, basically it says that if there's any crash reports going to be sent to engine, anonymous data, all that jazz, and the privacy details, such as, well, you don't really need this. Just leave it as it is right now. The gameplay debugger, I'm not entirely sure what that is for, but I believe it's inside the game. I never actually had to debug using this thing. I usually just hunt down manually, but I suspect when you have a bigger game, you really want to have some more control about this. So these are your hotkeys on how to use it, and what's the padding, and etc. I think it's in the actual viewport. The garbage collection is a very important tab. This is how basically the stuff that destroys things. You'd have a better understanding of it once we go over how coding works, and how code is executed, and blueprints and all that jazz. But if you think about it, it's basically like, because your game runs 60 frames per second, in other words, it's being updated every so often. Anything, how should I say it? Anything that leaves your scene, let's say you have a bullet, or let's say you have an arrow, right? You shoot an arrow, and let's say it doesn't fall off, it doesn't fall into the ground, just keeps flying forward. At some point, or a missile, right? Let's say you shoot a missile into the sky, or something falls down into a pit. So over time, you'd be shooting missiles, you'd be shooting them all the time, and they're just going to be there. They're not going to be destroyed themselves. They're not going to be removed. So this is exactly what this thing does. It basically removes stuff. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but here you essentially optimize on parallel garbage collection so that it can run on multiple threads. These clusters here, I think they're also for optimization. You can merge them into one, but I don't think that's advisable. Well, let's say you have a permanent object pool. Yeah, you can also have that. Let's say you need a specific thing that cannot be destroyed, should not be destroyed, should always stay in memory. You should be really careful with these settings, to be honest, because in general, it's kind of how should I say it? Important to keep your scene and to keep your game clear of any garbage, essentially, because that's the stuff that's not being used. Like the missile you fired and missed is not, nobody's going to use that. And obviously, this is not only for missiles or for object. This is for code. This is just the principle. So here you've got the max number. There's quite a lot of objects, so I don't think you'll ever go over 8 million. General settings are pretty intense here. You've got the fonts, the default classes for your different players, right, on the console, for example, or on a computer. Obviously, the fonts here are for your menus, which you set it up usually, in the actual menu. This is just the default stuff. The default materials, like when you drag and drop something from left and right, from the drag and drop bar, right, when you drag it over here, like a cube, right. This is what that's for. You've got your settings for how close, like the near click plane essentially means how close your camera is going to render. Subtitles, obviously, if you have subtitles on, and the blueprint. This thing here is it's a redundancy thing, as in if you accidentally create an infinite loop, or if you do something, it basically keeps looping all the time and hogs up all the processing. After I think it's 1 million loops. Yeah, after a million loops, this is gonna terminate it. Same goes for animation blueprints. You got optimizations here, and when it comes to frame rate, you usually want to have a smooth frame rate, and you should set like minimum and maximum. Level streaming is basically if you have an open world and you've got like a big ass level and you want to stream it in instead of load the whole thing in one chunk. The input here is the tab that we're going to use the most, I think, because these are your action mappings. Now in our game, really not going to have anything that important, but the axis mappings, the action mappings, this is basically saying that you're going to map these in this menu, and then you'll be able to access them through your code easier. For example, you can map the left and right arrow keys to the plus and minus X, and then you could just say plus minus X, right? You can just reference the X, and it's automatically going to parse into your function there. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but it's basically like having a little, like a quick translator. And the cool thing about this is that, let's say in our code we're going to say left arrow means left and right arrow means right, instead of left arrow means minus X and right arrow means plus X. What's going to happen is if you give the user the capability of changing the bindings, it might be a little bit tricky once they start changing different buttons, etc. Because in your code, if you hard referenced and if you said that left and right arrows are going to be the set arrows, so it'd be very difficult to change them to A and D. Well, not very difficult, but it will be unnecessary, right? You shouldn't have to do this. Obviously, you got these. You can extend them here, to how many access configurations. You got these toggles. You don't really need this. The mouse on touch, and these are your mouse properties in general. This can be referenced in the game. So if you have a mouse and you want to smooth it, you shouldn't really enforce it by default. Especially in a first-person shooter, you should give the ability to the player to actually remove this or enable it depending on their play style. The double click time as well, if you got double taps or something like that. It's very self-explanatory here. The capture mouse on launch essentially means that once you launch the game, your mouse is going to be centered in the middle. So you're not going to have to run into problems where if the player is running a windowed game and they move the mouse, and then the mouse is going to go outside the game, and what's going to happen is if they click outside the game, they're going to lose control over the window because the window will not be focused. What else do we have here? It's pretty much the same thing I just said here. Also some mobile options and the console keys, which would in this case is the tilde. It's the button next to the 1 on your keyboard. Now after that, you've got the navigation mesh, which is basically only for AI and controllers so that they can navigate easier. Honestly, I think we should just skip over this thing just for now, because there's a bunch of settings here that you don't really need. Most of them are just for the display, which you can enable it from your viewport. And the generation here as well, you can set it up for the default. Obviously, you can change them later down the line. What else do we have here? The query, the runtime. Yeah, I'm not really well versed in this bit here because I haven't actually had to use it that much. I haven't built such a huge game that I'd need nav meshes, but you can certainly look around these. There's hopefully well explained. No, not very well explained at all. Yeah, this is Unreal for you. I don't even know if you can find the documentation for this stuff. But like, listen, if you're ever gonna need to tweak these settings, you probably will know what they are. All right, and that's obviously in the future. We're not going to use a navigation mesh. After that, you've got the navigation system, which is basically how the actor navigates around your mesh. So let's say if a patrol is running around, you want to have this being cooked in or something like that. I believe that's how that's what this tab is for. Network is basically optimization here as well. As you can see, the max array size over, you can replicate, as in this is the size of the array if you have to communicate between yourself and the server, like if you're a client. And the memory here too. And then you got the physics, and this is the more exciting bit. You've got your little constraints. Obviously, you can do this, like I said, again in the details tab, where you can modify all this stuff. The default gravity is minus 900. Like, this is not like you could actually go full hardcore and define gravity as minus 9.8. Actually, no, sorry. In this case, it's not meters per second, it's centimeters per second, so that would be minus 980. But you can define this as the actual number of the gravity, because it's 9.80 something 22 meters per second. It's not exactly 9.8, so if you wanted to, you could do that. The terminal velocity essentially means how fast something should be going before it stops from the air drag. And then you've got the default fluid friction, which you usually change upon creation anyway. Then you got your scratch memory size, so how much memory you're going to dedicate for physics, and the ragdoll aggregated threshold. Like, at some point, your ragdoll is going to have to turn it into something. It's not going to be ragdolling forever. Then you got the simulation here, which, like, you don't need to enable 2D physics on our game. They're only for they're only for the flipbook, the actual 2D sprite type deal. The default degrees of freedom, you can obviously limit those in the constraints once you create an object, but like in our case, we would probably want it to run only on the X and Z plane. We wouldn't need the Y plane to go back and forth, but let's leave it like that for now. The bounce threshold velocity, it's essentially how fast something has to go before it bounces. Then you got the friction mode, how you combine different frictions and between different physical materials. Then you've got the maximum angular velocity, in other words, how fast something can spin. I believe 3,600, I think it's meters per second, is essentially or centimeters per second. I think it's a 360 per frame, right? If something can spin faster than 360 degrees per frame, or maybe this is, I'm not entirely sure, but obviously you can modify this. Depenetration velocity is for something called depenetration. I have no idea what that is. So we'll just leave it at 0 since it's at 0. The contact offset, that's actually pretty cool because it's essentially how much space you have for the physics to calculate between. So if you got a ball and your ball is going to hit the ground, so how much space it has between the ground and the collider of the ball to be actually considered as a contact. Right? So if you have a big number, you could have this calculation run even if it visually doesn't contact with the ground. And then you got the offsets here as well for this. You can simulate the skeletal mesh on your character on the dedicated server, though I don't know why you'd want that, but maybe for some reason, like you could obviously, like I said, enable and disable this in the details pane. I have no idea what CCD is. So yeah, whatever this is, it is something called optimization with CD never used, which removes any physics check internally, right? So if you don't run physics, you probably could disable them. Default shape complexity is what kind of well, obviously in physics you don't actually have your fully fleshed out character like we already saw. The statue in a previous video actually had a capsule on it, so it wasn't a 100% a match. Then you've got the asynchronous stuff, which is pretty cool. I think you can. I think that's what this does anyway. It enables you to run on 2 threads at the simultaneously. I don't know what PCM is, and I don't really know what missing locks are. And then you've got the optimization. This is actually pretty cool too. You can play around with these settings here to see if you get a performance increase. But like I said, what we're going to be doing is not going to be very heavy and very intensive on computation power. The frame rate, this is important here. Your physics delta time, which basically specifies the tick rate of your physics, because your physics are very expensive. They don't run as fast as a frame. So if you're running 60 frames per second, that doesn't mean that your physics are running 60 frames per second. In this case, I think this is something like 30 frames per second, maybe. I'm not entirely sure. But like, you can play with this one if you got a lot of physics object and you want to just see what's going on with it and maybe reduce the impact. The substepping, I really don't know what that is. All right, it's experimental. Oh, right, I get what substepping is. It's essentially, it's like, I think it's like halving, at some point halving the time of your physics calculation. So this, I think it has to do with the delta time, or maybe running in between frames or something like that. Then you got your physical surfaces, which you really don't need to add here. Like, let's say you have ice and rubber and gravel, etc. Like in terms of, let's say you have a car simulator, and you need to simulate different surfaces like hot road, cold road, like tire conditions, etc. You probably have them set up here. Your physics surfaces you can have up to 62 anyway, so like you can create a lot, as you can see. All right, the rendering bit is also pretty interesting because you need to check some of these settings before you release your game. We're gonna ignore mobile for now because it's mostly, you know, the same stuff as for regular rendering. Now, the materials bit is fairly explanatory, self-explanatory when it comes to unused materials. Like, basically disable them, remove them. The culling is good. You should leave this on. It essentially means that if you don't see something, it's not being calculated. So that's nice to have. I have no idea what pre-computed visibility is, but I believe that's only for mobile. If you have some, you know, if you have something already computed, like occlusion maps. The textures, the texture streaming is pretty cool. You should probably also use DXT5 normal maps. I don't know what DXT5 is. However, I think they are better in general than BC5. But we're not going to change this at all for our project. The reflections very important here, because if you get this number higher and higher, the reflection off a mirror, for example, is going to be more and more accurate. However, it'll also be more and more expensive. So if you got some big open worlds, don't go nuts with the reflections. Which is also, like, you can basically, you keep this activated here. With the forward rendering, this is important here because you have 2 types of rendering, like I already said, the deferred rendering and the forward rendering. It's a little bit more complicated than just saying this, but forward rendering essentially shows you what you see. So it'd be like raycasting from your, it just goes forward, right? If you're looking at me, it's basically calculating from your point of view what should be seen, whereas the deferred rendering is calculating per object. I believe that's the difference. But forward rendering actually has you know, a lot less options than deferred rendering. You know, if you make something in deferred rendering, it's going to look ugly in forward rendering. So make sure to know what you're working on. In general, if you're working on VR or mobile phones, you know, smaller games, forward shading is going to be your primary rendering method. All right, next you got the static lighting, the lighting in general. The static lighting, we already covered that when we were talking about light bulbs. The normal maps bit, I'm not entirely sure why would you need it unless you have some really fancy glowing statues or something that you need loads of um, what's its face? Let's say you have a grate, right, or some steel bars and like a prison maybe, or some ornamental Gothic type building, and you want the light to actually go through and have the feel, like the shadow being cast to be actually giving you the feel of depth or something. That's what the normal maps are for, I suppose. The mesh distance fields, I'm not sure what that is for. Like I said, most of these settings are very specialized anyway. This is good. This is good. This is your essentially, well, this is basically your level of details, so to speak. So you can always play around with this number to see what's more, what's better, like for your game in terms of draw distance. The translucency is also an interesting setting here. You can change basically how your transparent stuff behaves. If you had a glass, or maybe you had some white glue or whatever it is that you can see through, that's what you'd actually, if you want to optimize it, you'd actually play around here. The post-processing, it's not very, well, how should I say it? It's not very complicated. It's basically, if you got some stencils, you'd be using this setting, or maybe you could disable them. However, this doesn't really have any impact if you're not using them, I believe, so might as well leave them on. The default settings here, you should, like I said, probably enable your players to deactivate these at will. But the bloom is basically the sort of like the God rays, but on objects. So if there's light coming onto an object, it's gonna shine extra bright. The ambient occlusion, that's a very important thing. You should keep this on. Obviously disabling it, it's gonna improve the performance, but the ambient occlusion essentially means that it's checking the ambient light. Let's say, remember the skylight, remember the directional light that we had, which was our sun. So if you had I don't know, if you have a tree trunk or something that would create a shadow, or you were inside a tunnel, the ambient occlusion will calculate how much light should spread into the tunnel and how much of that light you're not going to see, which is pretty cool. Just leave these things on. You really don't need to bother with them. You should probably just give your players the option to play around with them. When it comes to anti-aliasing methods, now anti-aliasing is responsible for straightening out edges. So because we're running on pixels, like if you zoom really closely to your, if you've ever zoomed closely to pictures, so you've seen the pixels, they're basically square like these checkboxes here. So if you've got two of these together, they're not really forming a straight line. So you could it could create some really sharp lines, especially around your characters when they're on against some background. You really want the anti-aliasing method, anti-aliasing running there, so that you can smooth those lines. And these different methods have different performance impacts. Now the multi-sampling is probably the best one to use, the multi-sampling method, but it's quite expensive. This is the default method, this is the first anti-aliasing. I think I forget what F stands for, but multi-sampling is cooler than it, and temporal anti-aliasing is also cooler than this, so you probably never want to use this. Temporal is kind of like the mix between these two. Then you've got optimizations such as stencils. If you ever use stencils, really you can just play around with these, like how much your graphical buffer is going to be, and how much, like the morph targets, for example, would be your facial animations if you don't have any bones to them. I realize you're just starting out as a developer, you don't really realize what I'm saying, but just consider this as your facial animation button, checkbox. Then you got the VR, which we're not really going to bother, especially since most of it is experimental. This is interesting because once you have a big enough level, once you look at it in wireframe, it's going to look ridiculous. So this is your cull threshold when it's very close to your camera. The shader permutation, you should really keep all of these on, really. These are just supports, like you don't really need to disable them, because if you don't need them, you're just not going to add them. Obviously, you can disable them if you need to optimize your game, right? After that, you've got your rendering overrides, which for some reason, like I don't even know what this tab is for here separately, but whatever. Your slate settings is essentially your well, it's kind of like your UI, like if you want to have a keyboard or something in your game. But for our purposes, this is pointless. Streaming is also an interesting bit if you have your level streaming set up here. So if you have a big open world like Skyrim, you probably stream it, and you probably load it not on the main thread, as in you'd be loading it alongside your main game loop. These are some extra settings for this bit here, but you really don't need to bother about them. After that, you've got the I/O bandwidth limit. You should really keep this at 0 if you're running it, if you're using asynchronous. The level streaming is also pretty cool. You have to set up, obviously, how far away you need to, like, you see this, as in, I can't really explain this properly, but just forget about this bit here, because you're not gonna stream levels anytime soon, and if you do, you'd know what you're doing at this point. The tutorials bit, you don't really need this here as well. This is only for, I think, when you're creating assets and you want a tutorial there. The user interface is basically what you're gonna see. So your default cursor in the game once you launch the game, what your default cursor is gonna be. Like if you're gonna have text editing beam cursors, like these are all your standard UI elements. And obviously your DPI scaling should be set to 1. Don't change it. And really just let the player just drive the mouse speed from the hardware. Next thing, you've got the 2D editor, which we're not even gonna approach because I think it's dead within Unreal. Nobody gives a shit about 2D these days in Unreal. The appearance, this is actually nice. You get to check what kind of actually, I don't even know why it's under the Appearance tab, because this is the Units tab. It should be called the Units tab. It's very important. It took me a while to figure out that force is in newtons here, not of kilograms per... obviously, you can change it to kilograms force, but I really wanted to know if it's newtons so that I could figure out if the angular velocity is in meters per second or centimeters per second, because as you can see, the distance is calculated in centimeters and the time is calculated in seconds. So when you're trying to add angular velocity to something, you got to figure out if you're using centimeters per second squared, or if you really actually want to be using meters per second. Not squared, I'm sorry, just regular. But yeah, then you got your class viewer, which you don't need. We're not going to be using C++. Level sequences, we really don't need that just yet, but these are basically your blueprints, as in... if you create a timeline and where you say, let's say you have a bulb that has to change the color, and you say, right, I want it to change color every second, or over 10 seconds I want it to change the color so and so. So this is your timeline block in your blueprint editor. So these are your default, I believe, settings. I think you can technically change them unless... Oh, my bad. These are different. It's not the timeline. This is the these are the sequences for your cinematics. So if you're making cinematics or something like that, this is where stuff is going to be stored, and how many digits you're going to have, etc. Like, you don't really need to bother with this unless you're making a movie. The mesh simplification, you should keep this enabled, and you should keep this like that. All right, and that's the only thing you should know. After that, you've got the Paper 2D, which, like I said, is the 2D bit of engine, and nobody gives a shit about it at this stage. And the UMG editor is basically your UI. This is how you create the UI. Platforms, the Android one requires quite a lot of setup, and as you can see, we are not set up for Android. Right? You've got a bunch of different stuff. These are all settings that you do once you're done with your game before you ship it. Same goes for material quality, 2 different material qualities. The Vulkan is probably what you want to be running at. Obviously, this inherits from the Android here. And the Android SDK, I believe, is if you want to, like if you want for some reason to add the Android SDK here. As in, I think it's not, you don't have to manually do this anymore. The HTML5, same thing goes for HTML5 as for Android. But what bothers us right now is Windows, unless you're working on Mac and you want to talk on Mac. But essentially, they have pretty identical settings here, except Linux. Anyway, this is where you set up all your stuff, right? What kind of like rendering frameworks you're gonna have, what kind of splashes you're gonna have when you run the game, what kind of icon you're gonna have, what's the auto device. Like, these are pretty easy to understand, I think. When it comes to plugins, this is your level sequencer, which is what we were looking at before, by the way. But you shouldn't really bother with these plugins just yet. Anyway, these project settings are, well, you should play around with them, really. And at least when you're done with your game, at any rate. Not something you need to bother yourself with right now, with the possible exception of the input, because that's pretty important. And the collision, and maybe the garbage collection, and maybe the rendering, maybe the physics too, but not the rest. Right after that, we've got the editor preferences, which obviously reflect your editor, and they're not version controlled. All right, everything you do here is only on your local machine. It's gonna reflect on how your editor looks like, and I'm not really gonna explain this here because really, it's very simple, right? You've got your different colors. You choose what color you want, right, for different things on your editor. The experimental features, this is a cool tab, really cool tab. Every new release is going to have different experimental features. Some of them are going to be moved into the stable version, but you can enable them and play around with them. Like in the blueprints, you've got break-on exceptions, which is really cool, which is essentially your error handling, I believe. After that, you got the audio, the cooking AI. Like, you got a bunch of stuff here, really, which are obviously experimental and are not like, you shouldn't really release a game with these features in them, or if you do, you should do so at your own risk. And then you've got the I really don't know what that is. The sources panel would be, oh right, okay, this is the sources panel, and I actually recommend you activate this, because why not? Then you've got your keyboard shortcuts, and this one will actually be using it, because I think one thing that's missing in Unreal is a hotkey for this operation. So this calls maximize or restores the viewport. So if we write down in the search maximize, and as you can see, that's maximize viewport, I'm gonna say it's space bar. I'm gonna keep it like that, and I believe once we save it, oh no, don't even have to save it. So that's pretty cool. So you can select these different viewports with space. Prior to that, space was used to juggle these three transformation modes here, but as obviously W, E, and R do the same thing. So there's really no need to use space for that exact same thing as well. It's better to be able to actually switch across viewports. Right, what else we got there? We got your loading and saving, which is also pretty important, but we're going to have to go through this once we actually start going through the saving phase, as in, where we're going to store our saves, how we're going to save it, etc. Like, this is basically for your project autosaves, right? I believe this does not impact, or it does impact your game. I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to check it out. It's been a while since I had to, to open these settings up. After that, we got the miscellaneous. This is all the so that your engine can run better, right? This is all for well, it's miscellaneous, right? The FBX export compatibility, for example, you can export the newest FBX, or you can export it the oldest available here, 2010. Like, if you were going to export something from the engine, which why would you use less CPU in the background? This is all this stuff. Hot reload is only for C++ in general, so you don't really need to bother with that. Region and language is what language essentially is your editor in, so choose whatever you want. The source code is what your editor is. So in my case, it's Visual Studio. They support 2017 now. That's pretty cool. I didn't know they already did that. But yeah, apparently they do. So you go ahead and upgrade to Visual Studio 2017. The super search is something that it basically allows you to sort. I think if you press Shift and Enter, it's going to search on Google or whatever you specify here. Tutorials are all the available tutorials here in the upper right corner. The level editor is, well, the level editor. Like the BSP are our brushes that we already defined. These are the brushes that are responsible for. This is what we're going to use for our level prototyping, though I don't think we're going to be using it in our case. What else we got? The play button, which is, these are defaults for playing the game in your editor. And the play credentials, you don't really need this. If you're going to log in into your server, then maybe you have to, but otherwise no need. And then you've got your viewports, which is the control for your viewports. As you can see, there's quite a lot of extensibility. You can do whatever you want with your engine, really. You can set it up the way you like it to promote your workflow. When it comes to the animation and the blueprint editor, these are essentially your settings on how they appear and how they operate. Okay, we haven't actually used these, so I'm really not going to go through these at all because what would you use them for? You'd really need to actually, this is your workflow, for example. If you haven't used it, why would you need the workflow here at all? For example, the context menu, you shouldn't really have a favorite section because you should know what you need, and just typing it down is a lot faster. And the favorites is kind of an overkill because for most stuff like ints and variables, you have hotkeys. After that, you've got the content browser, which is as you can see, it's just one tab, just for a warning timer. Your curve editor is something that you just shouldn't touch because it's pretty good. Obviously, you can get all the curves or selected curves. It's better to have the selected curves to be more visible. The Flickbook editor is only responsible for your 2D. The graph editors are all, as you can see, quite quite different. So if you want to play around with these colors, please do. But for me, these are just fine. Sprite editor, just the background color if you import in sprites. Tile map editor, same thing, and tile set editor is going to be the same thing. The widget designer is going to be a little bit different, but this is essentially a snapping, I believe. Lock to panel and drag by default. Yeah, I think you have a hotkey for this. The privacy here is you don't really need to send data to Epic, but I think it's better because, what are they going to do with your data, really? The only thing they can do is improve the engine. The automation is something I never really used, and I don't really know what that's for, to be honest. So, if you know what this is, if you're some experienced developer looking at, for some stupid reason watching these useless videos for advanced developers, just please tell me what the automation is for. Although, as I need, I'll probably go through the documentation myself. The crash reporter is essentially well, if you wanna dump your own crashes into some, I don't even know why anyone would need this unless only Epic would probably need this. Then you've got the live streaming, which is allowing you to set your to stream just your development console, just your Unreal Engine window. Although there's way better software. In this case, OBS, and I forgot to close this. And after that, we've got your visual logger, which is also got a bunch of colors and different datas and a bunch of cameras and stuff. Basically, it's for the AI. You don't really need to bother with this bit here unless you really know what you're doing, because you could screw something up. Okay, phew. That was quite a lot of stuff, as you can see, and obviously I skipped a couple of them. The others, I didn't really know about them. Like I said, the engine is massive. There's a bunch of stuff, and you could probably extrapolate how many tools the engine has just by looking at the settings, because these settings are just global settings. So once you start drilling down at what exactly you need to do, the amount of stuff that pops up is ridiculous, and it's no surprise Epic has trouble with their documentation because the amount of stuff they have to document is unrealistic. It's on the size of Wikipedia. Well, not on the size of Wikipedia, but it's pretty big. All right, it's pretty big. I think they're trying to get some wiki type deal running so that people can write, users can write documentation. Okay, so that's it for this video, guys. We're gonna talk about setting up our first level in the next video, and we're gonna prototype our level so that we can see what exactly we're looking at, what we want. So yeah, see you next time. Bye bye.